Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and a huge happy Easter to each and every one of you. So, for the third year in a row, and I feel like it seems fair and just, I guess, because I literally have no other point of doing this otherwise, we are going to take a look at the Christian Cwiki article entitled Chris and Religion. Now, for the uninitiated, religion is a base of worship. And you can worship in so many different ways into so many different types of people, deities. Unfortunately, I don't really have anything better to say apart from that. Apart from when it comes to Chris and religion, Chris's take on religion seems to be more based off convenience than doing what could be ultimately described as the right thing to do. But whatever your take on religion is, well, just don't do what Chris does, I guess. I don't know. Maybe that's just the way to think about it. In fact, to be honest, the way you really want to think about Chris's take on religion is how some people have a slightly more empathetic attitude towards religion, i.e., they don't want to encourage people thinking about it too closely. How much of that is really true depends on person to person. However, let's get to it, shall we? I believe in God and Jesus too, but God must hate me to put me in the lifestyle I am forced to be cooped up and bored with. I don't exactly know what this is supposed to be about, but apparently this is from 2013. Yeah, and Chris under the impression that God actually hates people. That's a new one. That's a new one on me. Meanwhile, so I dare say, with all due respect to the Lord, meh. Chris abandons the Christian god for hyperdimension Neptunia goddesses. Which is kind of ironic, actually, because, to be honest, I think Chris is going to abandon hyperdimension Neptunia before long. If you are up with more current events. But maybe it's updated somewhere down the line. But in the meantime, let's cut to the chase, shall we? Religion is the belief in and worship of supernatural powers. Christian Winston Chandler's religious beliefs have significantly informed his beliefs and actions. For most of his life, Chris declared himself a Christian, being an attendant of 3 churches. However, Chris's form of Christianity deviates from other denominations as he incorporates a grab bag of blasphemous mystical beliefs from unrelated traditions and other sources. He further deviates from Christianity with long-held beliefs that he is of unique spiritual importance, having visions from God and magical powers. Online, Chris cherry-picked the Bible to reinforce his own beliefs while neglecting doctrine that may have had him to alter his own conduct. Chris long espoused traditional Christian teachings condemning homosexuality while ignoring that it also forbids premarital sex, pornography, and gluttony. This dissonance is exemplified in his reaction to the news that Panda Halo had been raped and impregnated by Clyde Cash. He actively encouraged her to spend time with her rapist because a child should know and be raised by both of its parents. Shortly after encouraging her to get an abortion, it's not even one step forward, it's just 2 steps followed by 3 steps backwards with Chris. God almighty. Even if you want to agree with the idea that the child should get to know both its parents, under those circumstances, Chris, I really don't think it's your choice at the end of the day. Actually, mind you, with that being said, that's something I've also kind of noticed a little bit from Catholicism over the last couple of years, is that there's a curiosity in terms of some people think they're so important, they have the authority to start to dictate to people exactly how they can act, because in the eyes of the Lord, that's what you're supposed to do. Strange that, but and it's not just Catholics who do this, but I'm trying to be fair. Is what I'm trying to say. Meanwhile, Chris's narrow view of the world requires that Sonichu and Rosechu in the comics and his true and loyal fan base in the real world share his religious beliefs. Meanwhile, all trolls will burn in hell. And by the way, narrow view of the world is just about the only thing in Chris's life that can be described as narrow. Sad but true, again. Meanwhile, under the influence of the idea guys, Chris abandoned his Christian faith and started following the CPU goddesses from the Hyperdimension Neptunia video game series on the 17th of December 2017. Well, they say abandoned, Chris just decided to start believing in something else, without much prompting and, to be honest, without much encouragement either. Chris just did it because he was told to do it. As his Hyperdimension Neptunia-fueled delusions spiraled out of control, Chris came to believe that he is the goddess CPU Blueheart, orchestrating the apocalypse, which will create a heavenly new world. Having taken time to read the Bible in jail after his arrest for incest from his own mother, so one may argue whether or not the Bible heavily it discourages the idea of incest. However, if you want to believe in the idea that the Bible doesn't, well, guess what? Go ahead and commit it then. See exactly what happens. It's not... Sometimes, guys, just because you can does not mean you should. And this idea was also probably lost on Chris because, as far as we're concerned, Chris doesn't really seem to have any regrets whatsoever. And I don't think has really caught on to the fact that he had to spend so much time in the clink. But that's a topic for another day. Chris believes he is the reincarnation of Jesus Christ, on top of everything else. His resulting religion, Neospiritual Christianity, is an unholy amalgam of authentic religious traditions, Christian and otherwise, troll forums, forgeries, and narcissism, mixed together with neither forethought nor consistency. He has demanded that watchers worship him and believes it is feasible that he could convince half of the world population to join his personality cult. But as you could possibly imagine, people straight up do not buy this. The reasons aren't really worth discussing, apart from nothing about it makes sense. That seems like a bit of a rash generalization of this whole affair. However, it's true. Nothing about Chris's stance on religion makes any sort of sense. And there's no point in trying to interpret whatever Chris's ideas, or for that matter, what Chris's logic is, because it's based on complete and utter false beliefs and insanity. But it didn't always happen like that. So let's go back to the very beginning. Early life. As a Christian man himself, Bob Chandler initially desired to name his son Christian, but was Chicken, and Chris's name change from Christopher to Christian at the age of 10 came from what may well have been the most divine intervention in the form of Leonard Bernstein, who mistook a Christopher as Christian, and in turn the young boy adopted the bear-given name. Chris has since referred to Leonard Bernstein in the same sentence as God himself, as he arguably spiritually interaction with and belief in the bear was the beginning of many unorthodox ideologies. With that being said, an event that early and that significant to warrant Chris's name change is possibly, it's a bit too significant for it not to take precedence in Chris's mind, I suppose. Meanwhile, Chris and Christianity. And even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them to a reprobate mind, to do those things which are not convenient, being filled with all unrighteousness, fornication, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, debate, deceit, malignity, whispers, backbiters, haters of God, despiteful, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, without understanding, covenant breakers, without natural affection, implacable, unmerciful, who knowing the judgment of God, that will not commit such things are worthy of death. Not only do the same, but have pleasure in them that do them. Romans 1:28-32. No, they're not talking about Chris specifically. However, Chris is relatively unrighteous and is relatively indulgent in sin, is wicked in his intent. By the way, everything you can see in blue highlights an article that this could also refer to as. So references to stuff like this isn't exactly without some sort of backstory, if you will. Anyway, so it's maliciousness, don't mess with me, envy, the high boyfriend factor, death threats, basically, as you can see right here, there's a lot of evil things, and Sonichu is the thing that comes up. That's kind of funny. Oh dear. Church attendance. The first church Chris is known to have attended is Korean Canaan Presbyterian Presbyterian Church in Chesterfield County, which he attended as a teenager in the 90s. Chris would later attend the Grace Baptist Church, a small Southern Baptist congregation in Charlottesville that launched in July of 2000. In 2008, he was, under mysterious circumstances, forced to leave that community, at which point he and Bob began attending Wesley Memorial United Methodist Church. Now, the reasons why Chris had to leave Grace Baptist, as far as we're concerned, is that the church's pastor apparently caught wind of the things that Chris was doing online. I don't exactly know how, but somehow these things must have been spread. Maybe Megan Schroeder, like things about that, happened to Megan Schroeder. Maybe Megan Schroeder might have, or maybe her parents might have attended that church, and then news started stirring and circulating about Chris's activities. With that being said, however, I've never really known the idea of a church to blacklist somebody from attending. That's a bit of a strange. That's very, very strange in my opinion. Now, I understand how there are certain congregations, and the idea is that certain churches actually will look down on people who they perceive as wicked. However, it's a relatively unchristian thing to do to forbade people from entering the church. The idea being is that all are welcome inside God's house. However, if we were, what if we were to take a look at this idea that this is technically a Protestant church, so to speak? I suppose maybe the idea, if we want to denounce between like the Church of England, Protestant, Baptist, Roman Catholic, even though it's sort of the same sect, there probably are different machinations. I'm more a common to Roman Catholicism myself. But yeah, that's like, it is strange. However, the more I think about it, I'm not entirely sure exactly, well, unless of course, maybe they gave Chris the opportunity to repent, but at the same time, it's not really their choice to force it on somebody to do it, just to say, you can come back to this church. But, we'll have to, that's something we might have to check out maybe some other time. Meanwhile, although Chris and Bob identified as Methodists as of 2009, Barbara continued to identify as a Presbyterian. I suppose that's maybe also the significant difference, but again, I'm not really too sure why what exactly a Methodist church could gain from blacklisting somebody. But whatever. In spite of all this, Bob and Barbara were married in a Baptist church, suggesting that they were never particularly particular about the differences between Protestant denominations. Wesley Mem is located near the University of Virginia and has an unusually liberal theology. The common conclusion among trolls is that congregations more in line with Chris's intolerance of homosexuals were equally intolerant of him, so he had to come there. The doctrine differences between the Baptist, Methodist, and Presbyterian denominations were probably too subtle for Chris to concern himself with, and he likely did not spiritually identify with any particular denomination of Christianity beyond simply being Protestant, or even just Christian, as suggested by his statement that Methodism and Presbyterianism are both of Christian religions. Again, that would probably have to be asked by somebody who knows more about... It's the sort of thing I probably should have asked my dad about, because my dad studied divinity when he was at university all the way back in the late 70s. However, the thing that seems to occur to me in all of this, however, and it's a bit of a strange one, is, well, what did Chris gain in terms of what did he think was the difference between Presbyterianism or Methodism or being even in a Baptist church? Just, did it go anywhere beyond in terms of tolerance towards people who were people who were batting for the same side, so to speak? Was there anything else Chris picked up on apart from literally anything else? Because as far as we're concerned, or at least by Chris's own admission, there wasn't. And that there was almost no real differences. Notions of God. In his early life, Christian declared himself a Christian and regularly attended 3 different Protestant churches, affirming a fundamental belief in an omnipotent, benevolent male God. He accepted Jesus Christ as the Son of God and Saviour of mankind, often referring to God and Jesus as a singular being that diverged from traditional Trinitarian doctrine. Chris believed that God had a special personal interest in his life, granting him visions, overlooking his faults, and promising divine retribution against those who mocked or opposed him. That's a bit of a oh dear, Chris. Oh dear. That's not the best. I mean, it's one of those things where Chris is sort of right in believing that God is omnipotent and benevolent, but the idea that God holds any sort of malicious or malevolence in him whatsoever, even those who oppress him, is grossly misleading, and it's not really the sort of thing you would even... It's like Chris views God less as God and more as just sort of a boss more than anything else, which you would have thought Chris would have disliked, because it meant that Chris was a worker of God, and if there's one thing Chris does not like is work, in more ways than one. Afterlife, which again, that's sort of more for the likes of I think we've covered the afterlife before, so let's move on to the useful topic of sin. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Jesus Christ himself in Matthew 5:44. Chris, I pray to God and Jesus to kill Jason Kendrick Howell. Chris on the Sonichu Girls forum. And this was just like a few days before Christmas of 2009, so not exactly very Catholic of Chris, or whatever you want to call it, to wish death upon somebody. Have a goddamn heart attack right now, this very moment you read this message, you goddamn blankety blank. An email from Chris to Vivian G. a few months before Christmas of 2009. Seems a little aggressive, so to speak, but now listen, guys, I'm gonna actually, before we go any further, let me just actually pause for a moment so I don't keep stumbling over myself in all of this. It's not unheard of, because here's the thing, Catholics are still human beings at the end of the day, and it's not exactly as if we're not prone to the idea of being angry or being, carrying around a disposition that makes us think that we are holier than thou. There are some that sadly do. However, I do understand that, guess what, it's neither really my place nor anyone's to start dictating the idea of just because you're a Catholic, therefore you have to practice what you preach. Because what Chris actually has been taught versus what he actually believes are two very separate things. And I think Chris is confident in his own mind to go forth with a methodology that seems to either suit his immediate interests or doesn't suit, because quite frankly, a lot of Chris's responses to a lot of things invoke anger and great frustration. So it's possible that Chris, well, literally has no control whatsoever of his own mind or even his own vices, because there are many such incidents of where Chris is shouting at people, is aggressive towards people online, and even in the most recent example where Chris sent out a message regarding the latest Hyperdimension Neptunia game, Hyperdimension Unlimited, in which Idea Factory and Combaheart, they actually created their own version of CPU Blueheart, and Chris, trying to remain calm, sent out a message warning both companies that they had to change it. So, and probably this is something we'll get into later into this article, but listen, Chris is still human at the end of the day. But unfortunately, it still doesn't change the fact that Chris says and does quite a lot of very un-Catholic things that actually seems to cause far more destruction than he realizes. Now, those things alone would be bad enough, don't get me wrong. But the thing that almost makes it worse, and it's a little bit of a harder one to sort of like define, is that Chris will never take accountability for it. Chris will never apologize for the things that he does, or if he does apologize, which is seldom or hardly ever, it's done with such little fanfare, and it's done with so little enthusiasm or remorse that it's very, very difficult as to work out whether or not Chris is just saying it to earn forgiveness, or whether or not Chris is just saying it just so that, well, he can appear to look good. More often than not, Chris will only do it unless he's actually provoked to do something, which probably suggests that Chris isn't really that confident in his own mind if he has to be told by other people what to do. Now, with that being said, there are loads of people all over the world who are incapable of really thinking out for themselves. However, if that's the case, then again, like I said with Daniel Lawson, it would have been probably better for everyone involved if, well, Bob had cut down the internet and Chris was not allowed access to it. Because at this stage, in nearly 20 years of Chris's infamous discovery, has anything Chris actually done on the internet actually made his life better? Not really, the more you think about it. But let's move on. Chris's understanding of Christian theology is extremely limited, and he does not seem to know anything about the Bible, although he apparently owns a copy of the New International Version. Fantastic, Chris. Guess what? I own a King James edition of the Bible. That does not make me, an encyclopedia on religion. His hatred of homosexuality, and nothing to do with the prohibition of sodomy in the Old Testament, which he was unaware of until he heard about it from Family Guy, his aversion to spilling his seed, and his dedication to the unborn, have absolutely no basis in biblical passages condemning sexual immorality and abortion. In fact, to be honest, I'm not even sure if it's even a thing that's even mentioned either in the Torah or the Quran. In fact, to be honest, I'm not really sure if it's even a factor in any other religion, to my knowledge. Certainly not Hinduism, certainly not Sikhism, certainly not Buddhism. Yeah, I don't really think it's like really anywhere else. Actually, to be honest, there is only one place where it does exist, and that's in Chris's mind, it would seem. Other than vehemently opposing homosexuals, trolls, and jerk-offs, Chris seems to have little notion about the nature of sin and evil, except that people who do things he doesn't like should go to hell, which is completely at odds with the part of Christian philosophy that states all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, and anyone who repents his sins will be redeemed. Now again, even for people who don't believe in God or don't even have a faith to speak of, some will say, well, does it make any difference whatsoever? it's interesting to note, even for people who have no religious feeling whatsoever, but they do believe in things, don't they? They believe they have something to look up to or follow towards. However, that's more their thing, and well, whilst we can't ignore, however, that guess what, people who do stuff like that mess with people, and that I believe some sort of consequence should fall to people, and you can't tell me that people who don't believe in God, who do bad things, will say they will do it willy-nilly, and guess what, they don't have to feel comfortable or even um proud or even surprised at the notion that they are completely immune from guilt, because it doesn't quite work quite like that. However, Chris believed that if he confesses his sins to God Jesus, he will be forgiven. Private confessions directly to God are not uncommon in Protestantism, but generally it's assumed that the confessor is doing so out of true remorse and genuinely to atone for mistakes. However, Chris abuses the purpose of confession so that he can vomit or commit whatever wrongs he wants and then wipe the slate clean with his confession. For example, Chris made a video in which he suggested that Clyde Cash and Jack Thaddeus commit sumo slide so that they can burn in hell forever. He later drew them just doing that in the comic. Just one day after the comic's appearance, Chris answered a fan letter asking why he had been wishing sumo slide upon them, and pointing out that such a wish conflicts with his Christian beliefs. Chris responded that he had confessed of that to God and Jesus, and they have forgiven him on that. One of two things happened. Either Chris wished for their deaths in the video, asked for forgiveness, then gleefully drew it happening afterwards anyway, or he waited until he finally got done saying his piece, then conveniently offered up his confession right after getting everything out of his system. Either way, such a confession is highly disingenuous. Then, of course, there's the third option in which Chris didn't actually, ask forgiveness from God Jesus at all, and then he just pulled that out of his ass just so that he appeared morally confined to the notion that, guess what, he still has to say sorry for when he believes he's done something wrong. Logically, the notion would go that the only reason why you would even go to confession at all is that you do so because you have something that you need to confess to God. Because more often than not, in Christian circles, when you go to confession, it's usually the fashion that the priest takes on the role of God. In circumstance, there's other examples like during the Passion of our Lord Jesus Christ. It's usually the fashion that the priest plays the role of Jesus Christ. He is supposed to be the representative of God, so to speak, a man of God, so to speak. And, well, to be honest, that does also raise the question about, has Chris ever once been to confession in his entire life? That's something we can only really guess at, and the thought of, well, it's the fact that Chris doesn't even mention anything about praying to God and asking for forgiveness. So, as far as we're concerned, I think it's the third option. Chris just said it just so that he could appear even remotely slightly bad in the foreknowledge that he did something wrong, and then just kind of rolled with it. So not only does it come across as highly disingenuous, it also comes across as manipulative to suggest the idea that, well, Chris can't be made to feel guilty because guess what, he forgived it, and apparently guilt is something to be forgiven of just as long as you say it is. Because to be honest, I think guilt, I'm not entirely sure if my ideas of guilt reflect towards other people, but as far as I'm aware of, surely if you've done wrong to somebody and you feel guilty about it, you want to make amends with them. Because in the eyes of God, that would almost seem as a little bit of a confession. The idea being is that when you commit sin, you commit sin against God and the like. An idea that, by the way, is not just secluded to Catholicism. It's a very, very common belief in amongst pretty much every other major religious circle. Because guess what? It's one of those ideas that actually makes a lot of sense. But that being said, when Chris gave in to temptation and cybered with Vanessa Hudgens in violation of his monogamous relationship with Ivy, Chris made a big production out of confessing his sin and seeking forgiveness. This suggests that he previously had little to no experience with the idea of repenting sins before God. Chris clearly does not follow the Christian concept of the 7 deadly sins, as he commits wrath, envy, gluttony, sloth, greed, lust, and pride constantly. Now, you may be confused about whether or not blasphemy is curiously lost in this, because whilst we're talking about the 7 deadly sins, there is just one thing I will say, and I've always kind of, it's an idea that's kind of been brooding in my mind for the last couple of years, and you know how Chris has a very, very poor and unhealthy diet? Well, I've attributed his diet and his consumption and his foreknowledge of how much he consumes that is, quite frankly, disastrous for his ailing body. I don't really associate that sort of thing with greed or gluttony. I associate that more with blasphemy. And the reason why is because Chris is actively betraying himself. He knows fine well that going to McDonald's every day is going to eventually kill him through heart disease or whatever else comes of it. But it's the fact that I think Chris, even back in his early 20s, was old enough to know far better. And there wasn't really, and you couldn't say Chris couldn't know this. It was very, very widely known, especially because, well, there were resources available back in the early 2000s. It's not exactly as if this was a thing that was discovered in the last number of years. So, but again, whether you want to associate eating fast food more with blasphemy than gluttony, I will see because if anything, gluttony I have associated more with the pride in your sloth. It's almost like you take pride in being overindulgent and fat and slobbish. Sloth isn't necessarily confined to just being lazy. It's more confined, in my opinion, to not doing things. Not doing things that you know you should take action and do things of, so to speak. But without this turning into a bit of a nuanced debate about the 7 deadly sins. But let's continue. Forgiveness. A major tenet in most any religion you can think of is the act of forgiveness. Unfortunately for Chris, he has no idea of what forgiveness really is, and will often hold grudges against anybody he feels have wronged him, sometimes even for years. So, while some may argue that he did show forgiveness in a few of his videos, even more will argue that such things were done either under an ulterior motive or is meaningless, as he goes on to curse and scream at them later on. This would suggest a major hindrance towards maturity just as much, because surely Chris... But then again, Chris has spent the last 20 years of his life not learning anything from what he's done, and will just make the same mistakes over and over and over again. And any attempt at hearing Chris saying he's sorry kind of doesn't wash, because Chris will just do the same thing later on. But let's keep rolling. During Chris's court hearing on the 10th of July 2012, it was discovered that Michael Snyder made an honourable plea that Chris should be shown leniency, as a felony was a life-changing event that could really harm Chris in the long run. This comes despite Chris scaring his customers away while he was still allowed in the store, shouting racist slurs at him, threatening to set fire to his business, and injuring him with his car. This was probably the most extraordinary form of forgiveness that anyone has ever shown towards Chris, even after the latter's horrible actions. Chris's show of gratitude was to go against all common sense and commit public slander in a court of law. I don't think that thieving liar deserves a red cent. And you can imagine the exasperation on literally everybody's face. And probably even Michael... the only person I feel like wouldn't be surprised would probably be Michael Snyder. Because despite Michael Snyder doing what he probably honestly believed was the right thing to do, I don't think anybody would have advised Michael Snyder to have gone down this route in terms of, well, giving Chris an honourable plea. But I think, I don't know why, like, Michael Snyder... It would be interesting to know exactly why Michael Snyder did it. Or rather, why Chris thought that saying all of this was a good idea either. But considering all of this was Chris's fault, by the way, Michael Snyder was just the victim. However, Chris has shown on occasion some more capacity to genuinely forgive and move on, as shown at MagFest, where he was seen making up with Adam Stackhouse, albeit after 11 years, and to be honest, I don't really feel... Did you think Adam Stackhouse even knew who Chris was, anyway, after all this time? Such forgiveness, however, has not been extended to the jerk cops, however. Yeah. Apostasy. Apostasy, by definition, is the abandonment or renunciation of a religious or political belief. For years, before the idea guys seized the opportunity to infuse patent absurdities into Chris's mind, Chris appeared to have become somewhat disenchanted with God. Traditional theology has long dealt with the problem of evil in books. Chris is unlikely to read at any time soon. Despite Chris's strong belief that God Jesus was backing up on the love quest, God has nevertheless imparted upon him such stress and trolling. He seemed to believe that the way prayer should work is the same way a little kid learns to get what they want by saying please. To Chris, prayer was apparently like, though not limited to, ordering a pizza. As long as you pray for something, it'll show up for you exactly how you ordered it. Since Chris hasn't exactly gotten what he has prayed for, or at all, the fault must lie automatically with God. In a farewell letter meant for his fellow parishioners at Wesley Memorial, he wrote that God sees fit for some hate-filled reason to continue to curse me as a jinx. I'm not entirely sure exactly what the parishioners were expected to think of when they heard stuff like this, apart from, don't let the door hit you on the way out. Probably. Meanwhile, on the 7th of September 2013, Chris cursed God's name on Facebook after a run-in with a jerk-op. God is giving me the middle finger yet again. I backed up and scratched a car in El Agave lot, and she's a damn smoker. Now the damn jerk-op is giving me a hard time because I am screaming up at Emmanuel God. I want God to just kill me now if he is going to keep giving me the middle fingers and a damned difficult life. He explained the reasons for his further disillusionment in a May 2013 letter to Kim. Now, it should also be worth noting, before we go any further, that from halfway into 2012 and almost all the way through 2013 is what's often referred to as the first exile saga of Chris, aka kind of the time when the trolls, by and large, left Chris well alone. But as a result of this, Chris was sort of out into the real world, into the wilderness, and left to his own vices. Chris didn't seem exactly to get on with being back in the real world. Because by this time, Chris was 31 years old, and it kind of became obvious to all those observed, and to those who've known Chris the longest, that Chris could handle being in the real world far, far less than he could actually being in the online world. Hey Kim, I have just read over some of the webpage Phil relayed to me. I must admit, and Amy is welcome to read this as well, it took me by surprise seeing the words magic and pagan in this religion. I like magic. I have fully accepted Jesus as my saviour, and my mother, father, and what I hear on television all have informed me about heaven, hell, The best way to live is as one does without much regret, or with moderate acceptance and happiness, and that God is within all of us, as energy and direction. And in the end, we all believe in the same goddess. Yet also, if God is supposed to love us all, why does he let me continue to have a lot of downs in my life? I often feel temptation towards destroying the Lego minifigure I have made in an image of God, or otherwise by just torturing it. I admit I am not perfect, but I prattle or digress. So all things considered, Amy, I am most willing to try your way on and see how I feel fully about it after. The way I figure it, at least I can still go to my church regardless. Soon thereafter, inspired by Futurama, because Chris can't think of anything unless it's something showed on a box, he seemed to divorce himself from a Christian conception of God altogether, choosing to believe in a rather capricious, relativistic deity. The higher force above us is always messing with each of our individual minds. Every day, rather each of you call him God, Emmanuel, Zeus, Buddha, or even the individual destiny of your own. I am not an atheist because I sincerely believe in the higher force of above us. Even Jesus may be the higher force's son. But every religion will have you believing in the one same higher force. Right or wrong, it is truly set up to each individual perception of every individual soul among us, the billions of people on this big blue marble among marbles in the universe. Okay. Mysticism and sorcery. As early as 2003, Chris has invoked curses against his enemies. Most famous is the Kamehameha borrowed from Dragon Ball Z, which he had employed against Mary Lee Walsh. His magical thinking has been directed in various ways, as when he thought he could shift his body fat about by watching hypnotic internet videos, because Chris is an idiot. In recent years, he has embraced several occult teachings and practices from the New Age movement, out-of-body experiences, chakras, and special powers associated with crystals, among other things. Chris's willingness to embrace magical thinking made him a substitute to manipulation from trolls, climaxing in a strong reality disassociation from brainwashing at the hands of the idea guys. Delusions of godhood. Fear not, for behold, I bring tidings of great joy. Sonichu from Sonichu issue 10. Great start. I prayed for forgiveness from the real Christian. Sonichu, will he forgive me? I don't know, Aspie. I really don't know. Beyond his self-infatuation, visible from any of Chris's creative output, Chris has shown from an early period the nascent belief that he might have been specifically chosen. Chris might have developed a god complex as early as the year 2000, as the halo floating over his head on the cover of Christian's favorite hits seems to indicate. In his emails to Reggie Fils-Ami, he seems to call himself Jesus. You have my word as an avid gamer, Lamb of God, and humble human being that I will work very hard to save. However, this could also be a malapropism for Word of God. More definite signs first emerged in late 2009 and have accreted over the decade since into Chris's current apotheosis. Starting on page 42 of issue 10, Chris displays a somewhat disturbing twist to the plot, such as it is, of his comics. Ultra Sonichu frees Zelina Rosechew from her stony state using his chaotic powers, then appears to Darkpine Sonichu with a message similar in tone, if not outright text, to prophecies of the coming of Jesus Christ, complete with arms outstretched as if he were suspended on a crucifix. Later on in the issue, Ultra Sonichu travels to the world of Asperchu, where the characters of that comic inform him that they were forced into their roles by Alec, and that they had been praying to Christian Western China for deliverance and forgiveness. So lo and behold, Chris did send the Messiah Sonichu to end their suffering. Sonichu uses the chaotic remedy to miraculously cure them of all their Asperger's syndrome, even though only Asperchu himself had the condition, and gives them new names and new, better looks. It should be noted that, like Jesus Christ, Sonichu was born to a virgin. Actually, to be honest, more than anything, Chris is less of a god figure. He's more of like the only real comparison I can make is possibly Chris is more aligned with, let's say, I don't know, maybe Unicron from Transformers, as opposed to actually God, because Unicron is more of a chaos bringer, and that suits Chris's tone very, very well, the more you think about it. Meanwhile, even before this, Chris had directly compared himself to God. In issue number 7, after Christian is lost in the time void, Sonichu says this: "In the meantime, he will receive the accumulative memories of the passing moments. So in a way, he is looking down on us, like our Lord and God are able to, but the vision may be blurred." From Sonichu issue 7. Meanwhile, possibly in response to criticism about acting as God in later pages, Chris addressed the issue of the non-canon chaotic combo worshipping him in an incredibly ignorant manner. First, he declares that he is not God, but a servant of him and Jesus, and immediately after goes on to forgive Michael, the copycat Sonichu made over name, for bearing false witness against Chris, as if he has the authority to forgive the breaking of the 10 Commandments, like he's God or something. In addition, only 5 pages later, Angelica condemns those who prefer Alex's artwork over Chris's as blasphemous. Yeah, do you remember what I said about 30 minutes ago about how there are some people who believe they are so holier than thou that they can start dictating what counts as blasphemy and not? Yeah. Oh dear. Further evidence of Chris's blossoming God complex comes through his answer to some of the frequently asked questions that were to put him via the mailbag, where he states he considers Sonichu to have over 1 billion fans. The only other character who claim such a number is God Jesus or Allah Muhammad. This number, or this mad mentality, is compounded by the fact, or whatever it may be in this case, that Chris is like a god to Sonichu. This means that his opinion of himself is that of a god's god, or maybe a god's bear. Chris moves in very mysterious ways. Chris's God complex has peaked with him believing he is the reincarnation of Jesus Christ. Why God would ever decide that his son should return in the form of a fat man-child, we will never know. It's not exactly Chris knows things that we don't, because Chris sadly knows very, very little, as all evidence has proven. Yeah. As a goddess myself, I am unable to worship in churches, according to Chris, circa June 2019. It was under the Idea Guy's manipulation that Chris's gathering Apostasy came to a head. In November 2017, Chris became obsessed with Hyperdimension Neptunia, a video game/anime series. He declared a belief in body sharing with a goddess character who represents the Sega Dreamcast in the series. By consulting with Magi-chan, then leaving his Dreamcast console powered on for 24 hours, in order to focus his own psychic power onto it and pull the goddess into his body. Since then, Chris has come to believe that he's actually a goddess to the Sonichu universe, leading to the creation of the Devotees of the Chris-chan Sonichu. Part of me also wonders in some strange way about whether or not the only reason Chris was told that is in this bizarre idea that, guess what, we could probably set Chris's house on fire again through this. Who knows? The Quran is the Bible as Family Guy is to The Simpsons. Oh dear God. I almost forgot he said that. And if there are any people who worship Islam watching this, I do apologize, because what on earth is that? What the hell is that supposed to mean? Following the revelation of Chris engaging in incest with his own mother, and what a strange segue that was, he was arrested and kept in jail for 1.5 years, with his only way of communicating with the outside world being via letters. Upon booking, Chris was given a Bible and eventually allowed to purchase various other supplies from the commissionary using fan donations. Among other items, these included, but not limited to, 2 Turkish prayer rugs, which Chris used for warmth and playing solitaire on. Kengel attempted to send him a Quran in an attempt to convert Chris to Islam, but it was rejected by the jail, and Chris bought one from the commissionary. He described it as literally all over the place, and stated that Muslims are indirectly praying to Bob, as Allah was formed from a piece of her. I literally want to bang my head against the wall for reading something so stupid. It should be worth noting again that this all happened, by the way. Not Allah being formed from a piece of Bob. I'm talking about this, like, in Chris's world, this all happened. Despite being stuck alone in a jail cell, Chris claimed to meditate 24/7, 365 plus 1, and have full access to the Akasiac records, and that he can see into the past and future. He is able to visit alternate dimensions where all of his cartoon characters live, and he is accompanied by Magi-chan and Mewtwo, among others. Chris has documented his time in jail in the Goddess log. It contains insights from the Akasiac Guardian, but also a list of names and addresses of everyone who has written to him. Chris said he planned to release this after the dimensional merge, but due to potentially doxing a number of people, names and addresses have been censored in the excerpts released after he was released from jail. From his jail cell, Chris passed judgment on various people from his life and decides whether they have passed their divine test. Kengel passed, Bella definitely failed by making the incest call public, Dylan Thomas failed by confirming that Chris had said that he had sex with his mom, Noel failed and is Chris's version of Judas. Chris feels betrayed by Noel, and you may be confused by why that is, but, well, Chris said that Noel failed in Chris's version of Judas because Chris feels betrayed by Noel because Noel tattled on him for breaking his EPO by stealing $750 from Bob, which Chris claims to have paid back. No evidence to this, however, but ironically, Noel is now selling silver coins bearing Chris's likeness. Make of that what you will. Chris has produced various holy items made out of trash, which he mailed to people who write him respectful letters. One is a Neospiritual Christianity token of uncertain purpose, made from the bottom of a styrofoam cup. In other letters, he has included blessed bottle labels from Fanta and Coca-Cola bottles. These bear Chris's very long signature and his NSC logo, which is composed of a standby symbol, combined with a Christian cross, a blue heart, and Sonichu's lightning bolts. The recipients are told to laminate these labels and wrap them around 20-ounce bottles for use with water and non-alcoholic beverages. They may laminate photocopies of their own label for their spouse and children. Well, when you demand so aggressively, Chris, no, I don't think they're going to do that. Some of Chris's letters have included apocalyptic prophecies, some of which he says are already happening. Neurotypical individuals will suddenly speak multiple languages, including ancient ones, and shall download into their brains massive amounts of knowledge from the Akasiac records. Their brains will overload and burn with fatigue, and they will appear to be schizophrenic. If you encounter one of these individuals, you should not interrupt them. Animals will speak and humanoid animals will appear. For the record, apocalyptic prophecies usually are not accurate. I wonder why that is. Through the ancient art of looking around and seeing, none of these prophecies have come true. After his release from jail, Chris still maintained belief in being Jesus. To this very day, it would seem. In May of 2023, he signed a received J. Christ Chan Sonichu for a cashier at the Earthbound Trading Company. In August of 2023, he changed his PlayStation profile description to read, "I'm Christ Chan Prime." In the videos and live streams he's made since moving into a new house, he has consistently referred to himself as Jesus Christ Chan Sonichu Prime. Devotees of the Chris Chan Sonichu religion. Chris has some divine revelations, which he shared on the 2nd of November 2019. In a series of tweets, these revelations are as follows. 1. He is the goddess of the Sonichu/Rosechu species and is of a higher deity level than a CPU. 2. His powers are more apparent and potent in C197 but do exist in 1218. 3. The terms quickens and quickenism does not feel or sound fitting for his religion. 4. They do not sound appealing either. Yeah, and I think you can probably guess why. And 5. Devotees of Chris Chan Sonichu, or Docs, is chosen. Pronounced Docs, like Chris's favorite pastime. Ooh, sick. And thus, Chris's true and honest religion, Docs, was born. The Docs all share kindness and loyalty, which is a defining figure of a devotee. They also pray to Chris and channel energy to him so that he can use his goddess powers. Sonichu has noted that it's far easier for Chris to answer prayer in C197, due to his additional power that he has access to in his Chris Chan Sonichu body. Chris can also store this energy in magic stones, and often wears these around his neck with the Sonichu medallion. Chris used one of these stones to demonstrate his power, even in 1218, by dropping it with as little movement as possible, which, when scaled up to C197 proportions, would equate to a miraculous healing. Chris thinks that the crystals contain healing power and that they can make you happy. Sure they can, Chris. Whatever you say. Moving on. The first Holy Temple of Docs. In late 2019, the first Holy Temple of Docs was consecrated. The temple has been an essential in-between in traversing between this dimension 1218 and its sister dimension of C197. The whole property, including the gazebo and the sheds, have travelled back and forth from 1218 to C197 many times. Unlike most temples, or if not all of them, almost no Docs congregate there to worship, and instead the temple acts as private residence to their deity, Chris. Upon reaching level 40 in Pokemon Go, Chris was able to put the temple forward for an additional consecration ceremony for Niantic, the creators of Pokemon Go, to become the true and honest Pokestop of them all, which he did on the 20th of August 2020. However, despite numerous efforts to rally his devotees to help the nomination be accepted, his nomination was eventually denied. The gazebo on the property contains magic power, and using deity-level powers can be used as a vessel for a portal between the dimensions, and can transport items and even living things. Interestingly, in the TSSF card game, its card is a unicorn card and can be in a relationship with Pony OCs. Though this is probably due to Chris using the card game wrong rather than him regarding his gazebo as a unicorn. Hopefully. Or maybe Chris is just kind of stupid. Doctrines of the Devotees of Chris Chan Sonichu. Chris's convictions, not that kind, are a confused tangle, even shifting as weens twist his malleable perception of reality and his mental state continues to deteriorate. The below seeks to describe Chris's contemporary beliefs as accurately as possible, though information is subject to change in light of new revelations at any given time. Chris has hesitated to describe his beliefs as a religion, but on the 30th of April 2018, Chris claimed in a Twitter post that he no longer follows a religion, yet he is neither atheist nor Satanist, and over a year later would describe what follows as a belief and faith system, not a religion. Uzume possession. Initially sharing his body with a clone of the CPU goddess Uzume Tanobushi was critical to Chris's newfound religion, naming the clone that resided within his body as Orange Spiral Seal. Chris believed that he had the powers of the four main goddesses, as well as his own powers. In a way, this was a bizarre continuation of his classic love quest. Not only did he believe that he could create a new CPU goddess from the ground up, but that, with the CPU, he will bring Crystal into reality and create her as a CPU goddess, saying that is something that God Jesus would never grant to him. Chris's religion has little in the way of ethics, but he has indicated that he believes in the Hindu concept of karma, administered by himself as an instrument of his vengeance against the jerkops who tormented him in years past. CPU Blueheart. On the 16th of June 2018, CPU Blueheart, known as Scarlet Celestia, came upon Chris and gave her his powers, making him CPU Blueheart, goddess of Comma Nation, the Commodore consoles, Quickville, and all Sonichus and Rosechus, and everything else. However, Chris only found out about this on the 3rd of August when his hubby Magichan told him. In the same way Chris had connected with his Dreamcast before, this time Chris connected with his Commodore 64 to obtain her memories and soul. This possession helped Chris develop his psychic and electric superpowers, and helped the merge become closer as C-197's characters became more tangible in 2018, in 1218. He also started feeling more energy, surges, and electricity flowing in him. Chris also felt long, loud belches as a result of the possession, which were obvious indicators of the impending merge. Chris was being given a lot of responsibility for the merge when he became CPU Blueheart. Chris also claims to be feeling heart attacks that he pulls himself back from. Whilst these are obviously not heart attacks, they are certainly some sort of ongoing health problem for Chris, and these delusions are preventing him from getting the help he needs. Or if Chris was to receive help, what do you suppose Chris would just throw it back, saying that them doctors don't deserve a red cent either? Worship. As late as August 2017, Chris could be seen in a normal church, albeit irreverently wearing his unicorn cosplay. However, he has since stopped attending, believing that he is unable to worship Jesus or any of the other deities, on virtue of him being a goddess himself. In Believe in the OCs and Deities, Chris appears to his viewers to send positive thoughts to fictional characters, as though through telepathy, perhaps indicating that he believes divine power requires worship and oblations. Implicit in this is Chris's long-standing secular belief that he has hundreds of millions of earnest followers across the globe. On the 22nd of December 2018, in a long rant on Twitter about the merge, Chris encouraged his audience to pray to him. I encourage everyone to keep faith and pray to the CPUs. Y'all may pray to me as well. Yeah, got off the deep end. He has made several such appeals in months since. The Pantheon. In August of 2016, Chris revealed that he thinks of God as a goddess. Chris has long considered women to be good and men to be evil. And since Chris does not want to think of himself as good as God as evil, he simply swapped the genders in his mind, making Tom Girl Christine and Goddess Emmanuel. During a conversation with Joshua Wise, Chris revealed that he had forsaken Christianity altogether, believing instead in the CPU goddesses from the anime Hyperdimension Neptunia. Chris's view of God's nature is naive and even childish. He has used the fandom jargon acronym OC as a rough quickenism synonym for God, and uses this broad category to include Christ, Men respected but not worshipped in their own separate traditions, like the Buddha, ancient pagan gods such as Zeus, the Neptunia CPU goddesses, and other anime characters himself, and his viewers as lazy polisonas. He is extremely syncretic, believing all of these, including the latter categories of clearly fictional characters intended and universally understood as such to be real and divine. Monotheism, the cornerstone of Christendom that cannot be compromised, was apparently never assimilated into Chris's thought processes, allowing him to continue regarding Christ as a god. He claims to converse with and be friends with Jesus and several other deities. Nonetheless, Chris does not worship literally everybody. In a 2019 Twitter post, he was alarmed by Jacob Sockner's apparent Satanism, saying that no one should ever worship Satan. Concept of Emmanuel. Chris first uses the term Emmanuel in a Facebook post from August 2014, but it is not until a post from 2 years later, "Oh, for God's sake, Emmanuel," that he explicitly uses the name to refer to a female deity and not simply as a typo for Emmanuel, a Christian name for God. Chris probably got the idea of a goddess Emmanuel from one of the feminist or lesbian Facebook pages which he followed at a time. But he took it to be a literal female deity instead of a joke. Somehow Chris held onto this concept throughout the idea guy manipulations and incorporated it into his CPU goddess pantheon. In his jail letters from 2021, Chris reverts to the biblical spelling Emmanuel, probably because that is the spelling he encounters in the Bible, which he has been reading in jail, but continues to refer to the deity as female. Chris calls Emmanuel God above all other gods and goddesses, and claims that she encouraged him to bang his mother, a claim which he also makes in the incest call. In another letter, Chris calls Emmanuel his mother. Some took this to mean that Emmanuel was really Barbara, but Chris explained in a subsequent letter that Emmanuel and Barbara are two separate individuals and souls. In 2022, he further claimed that, "I have never said nor felt my mom. Barbara Ann Weston Chandler Sonichu was a god of any sort, nor is she Emmanuel, or even Virgin Mary reincarnated. If anything, Barbara is the reincarnation of Merlin the magician, but Emmanuel, God above all gods, was my father when I was born in Bethlehem over 2022 years ago. Emmanuel had changed her gender to female in physicality and form over a century ago. Emmanuel planted an ovum from her ovary into Barbara's ovary to attract me from my forward and backup trip through time after what happened with me in 1389 when the universe was divided into my second physical birth on February 24th, 1982, into this immortal body of mine. With that, Emmanuel is my mother. I am still half Sonichu physically due to my trip through the apex of the chaotic rainbow of 2003. Between Sonichu Prime and Rosie Rosechu Prime, remember Emmanuel herself can change her physical form into any creature, including a Sonichu form, yet Arceus, the first main one, was manifested from a piece of her. Chris is absolutely insane, and I'm scared. Don't hug me, I'm scared. Neospiritual Christianity. Neospiritual Christianity, spelled without a hyphen, is Chris's self-proclaimed term for his peculiar set of beliefs concerning reality and faith, developed while confined in jail after being exposed to the Bible. Not like that. This new belief system combines aspects of Protestant Christianity with his pre-existing beliefs originating in theosophy, the New Age superstition, and the dimensional merge. Cosmology. Chris believes that he is the reincarnation of Jesus Christ and that Barbara is the reincarnation of Merlin the magician. He believes that his affair with his mother constitutes as soul cleansing, an operation designed to heal and purify her. Justified by his belief that he is the reincarnation of Jesus Christ, Chris upgrades Christianity to Neospiritual Christianity and created a new 10 Commandments that serve in part as a statement of secular humanist beliefs. Although Chris upholds the prohibition on blasphemy and the observance of the Sabbath. Updated 10 Commandments, or Amendments, by Jesus Christine Western Chandler Sonichu, October 14th, 2021. 1. Thou may have and worship one or multiple gods, goddesses, and demigods, or even none at all, whichever best feels well and good with thee. 2. Thou may make yourself an idol that is safe and good and blessed. Thou must not make yourself an idol that is harmful, toxic, or demonic to you or anyone else. 3. Thou must not misuse the name of your Lord, your God, or any other god, goddesses, or demigod. God damn it, shall be most punishable as well. 4. Remember to observe the Sabbath day, Sunday, by keeping it holy. Does that include having a space between it and holy, Chris? Because it probably should. Honor thy father, mother, and any of all legal guardians that have helped greatly in your raising and support. 6. Thou must not commit not murder, nor commit or help another to commit suicide regardless of circumstance. 7. Adultery is okay, well and good, as long as it's all involved and direct, open, and honest with each other. Thou must not commit adultery in secret from thy partners. 8. Thou must not steal. 8. Thou must not testify falsely against thy neighbor or anyone, nor testify without prior knowledge of the greater context and truths of the circumstances and details. 10. Thou must not covet thy neighbor's belongings. The remaining cosmology of Neospiritual Christianity synchronizes predominantly Christian beliefs with a belief of Akashic records originating in theosophy, various New Age spiritual concepts, and his pre-existing belief in the dimensional merge and alternative universes. Chris and other faiths. Given his sheltered pre-existence in the heart of the suburban American South, Chris probably hasn't had much direct exposure to anything but mainstream brands of Protestantism. When his fans asked him for his feelings on other religions during an IRC chat, he glossed over the question and simply reiterated his own unthinking statement of faith. At other times, his comments have been scattered and inconsistent. Other Christian denominations. Chris has no connection to Catholicism, which he seems to regard as a benign but alien practice. In his comics, he assigns it to a minor character, Angelica Rosedew, whose faith doesn't particularly differentiate her from the rest of the inhabitants of Quickville. What a surprise. Though Angelica, it is obvious that Chris knows almost nothing about Catholicism and seems to think it's just a variety of Protestantism with nuns. He refers to Catholic priests as pastors and almost certainly doesn't know the Catholic Bible is different from the one generally used by Protestants. Also, Angelica's home congregation is called Samuel Memorial United Christian Church, which is about the least likely name for a Roman Catholic church Chris could have come up with. He does, at least, realize that Catholicism is a form of Christianity. Okay, that's a start. Although he probably has no idea what its relationship to Protestantism actually is. Panda Halo's persona was designed to be a devoutly Roman Catholic, specifically to confuse Chris's desire for premarital sex with contraception. Faced with this unbearable challenge, Chris tried to argue that God really does allow premarital sex because his pastor said so. Ironically, deference to a cleric on ethical matters is far more typical for Catholics than Protestants. It didn't even occur to Chris that what his pastor said to him wouldn't apply to a Catholic, because Chris is incapable of seeing things that from perspectives besides his own. Chris has described Mormons as not being dateable. He has never explained why this is, however, but he may have learned through Anne McLaren that Mormons typically don't date non-Mormons. While it is not clear how much Chris knows about Unitarianism, likely not a lot, he is not hostile towards that sect. Jackie identified as a Unitarian, and Chris was not bothered by this, conceivably because he didn't know what it was. Given that he takes his own religion a la carte, Chris is likely unaware of most of the differences between the sects of Protestantism and the relationship between Protestantism and other kinds of Christianity. He has never been pressed for comment on Eastern variants of Christianity, such as the Eastern Orthodox Church, and it is uncertain what he thinks of these sects, or if he is even aware of their existence. Finally, other religions. Most of Chris's opinions towards non-Christian faiths have been culled from South Park and other television series. For example, on the 28th of December 2009, Chris wrote a blog entry telling Jack Thaddeus to get out of the closet and go to blankety Scientology. Following this comment, Chris was asked to elaborate his thoughts on Scientology. He asked that he neither agrees with it nor disapproves of it. Okay. A Sonichu and Rosechu Christmas story and Sonichu issue 11 reveal that Chris has a somewhat basic aware of Judaism, probably picked up from watching South Park. He appears to not understand that Jews and Buddhists don't celebrate Christmas, at least not the religious aspects of it. However, in the way he wrote it, it is unknown if he's implying that Christians, Jews, and Buddhists go to the same place of worship. God damn it, Chris. Or if he's saying they go to separate places of worship and calls them churches, because his vocabulary is heavily lacking. And it's so heavily lacking that such phrases like synagogue or even temple don't even exist in Chris's world. Or in Quickville. In Michael Snyder is cold-hearted and mean, Chris uses the word Jew as an insult, which he also got from South Park, and states he is just throwing it out there. He is throwing out there anti-Semitic slurs because apparently that's just throwing it out there. Apparently that's the mature thing to do in Chris's pea brain. Also, by the way, Michael Snyder is not Jewish. But it's because Chris thought he was. He thought that's the way to actually make it as hurtful as possible. That's just how much of a dick Chris is at times. He incidentally subscribes to his father's view that Snyder, Megan Schroeder, and others were secretly directing the trolls to ruin Chris's life. Some favoured comedians is a thinly veiled, furious backpedaling attempt to which he rambles on and on about how he respects Jewish comedians like Jerry Seinfeld. Okay. Meanwhile, not to knock on Muslims, but the Quran, I'm not even reading on that again. I don't understand. In a Wikipedia article, he hints at a hatred of Islam. Although the article primarily exists to deny various accusations trolls have made about him, he does not deny being a prolific hater of all things not Christian. Years later, in a letter from jail, Chris responded to an apparent attempt to convert him to Islam by stating, "Allah is a good God, yes, but even he has his imperfection," and concerns over his followers and nationality of Islam, and that Islam contains a total population that includes around 40% of toxic haters, fakers, and sinners within it. For comparison, the base rate of toxic in the global population is only about 18%. Chris's obsessive fan, Kenneth Engelhardt, is a Muslim convert. Chris tolerates his religious beliefs, but has become annoyed with Kenneth's repeated attempts to convert him to Islam. Besides using the popular Western image of a fat Buddha, actually a Chinese monk, and mentioning Buddha a few times, Chris has never shown any knowledge of traditional East Asian religions, let alone any opinion of them. Vivian G's belief in Taoism seemed to be a concept he couldn't process and even seemed to make him uneasy. Why, I do not know. New Age. The New Age is an umbrella term referring to a variety of new religious movements and alternative spiritual practices originating in the Western world during the 1960s, whose practices or practitioners are referred to as the New Agers. These practices include various forms of prayer and meditation conducted along a multitude of cosmologies, combined with various pseudosciences such as astrology and alternative medicine. New Age beliefs often encourage magical thinking, which only serve to reinforce Chris's beliefs in his supposed divinity. Unlike most other religions, New Age worship does not typically occur in organized places of worship and instead takes place at home or within for profit storefronts. New Age worship practices frequently incorporate yoga and other exercise routines. Considering Chris's poor physical health and attitudes towards exercise, Chris will never do this, period. Chris has affirmed his belief in various forms of New Age practices in the past, all of which were synchronized with forms of Christianity and his own beliefs in the dimensional merge. Chris has performed tarot readings, believed in magical stones, and meditated in the hopes of achieving astral projection. Theosophy. Theosophy is a minority religion founded in the 19th century. An adherent of Theosophy is known as a Theosophist and believes worship at Theosophical societies. Members of Theosophy predominantly consist of converts to the faith, rather than family-based groups. Chris has been influenced by Theosophy in his affirmation of the Akasic records, mentioned in various jail letters to fans. Owing to the religion's denial of free will, the Akasic records are believed to be a flawless compendium of all thoughts, actions, and words spoken by all human beings in the past, present, and future. Theosophists believe that they can access the Akasic records to heal past wounds, lift pain, and past issues, and find a higher expression for their lives. The origin of Chris's belief in their existence of the Akasic records is unknown. Chris appears to incorporate every spiritual or supernatural concept, regardless of whether it is intended to be religious or purely fictional. He finds it a bizarre pantheon of spirituality. Atheism. But I would certainly not want to be an atheist, because if I don't have God or Jesus by my side, I would be more or less lost as I was considerably beforehand. Atheists are the devil's spawning, as it would seem, and I would not want to be amongst them that they would want to run out of town with the pitchforks and the haste and the fire. As a believer, I would be either I would like to be a peacemaker, but I certainly wouldn't mind being one with the pitchfork, following the crowd and pushing the atheist out of town. Well, so much for being a peacemaker then, Chris, if your thought is literally to go along with the crowd and literally resort to violence before anything else. However, in reality, Chris saying he would be one with the pitchfork, but to be honest, I would say Chris would be one with the pitchfork in the same way the American Gothic was then with the pitchfork. I think that's about as far as it would go. By the way, for those who don't know, the American Gothic is that famous image of like these two farmers somewhere in the south with like a barn behind them, and they're sort of not particularly very happy, and they're holding pitchforks. That's pretty much the American Gothic right there. Now, Chris's opinion of the irreligious is the most facilitating and incoherent, and incidentally one of the best documented. Unsurprisingly, he doesn't seem to like or trust atheists, but even there, he has had a hard time articulating his opinion. Shock of all shocks. When Vivian asked him to explain why he dislikes them, he said, "I don't know, but I do know that they are not believers of God and Jesus." When Chris exposed Forg, his reasoning for wanting people to troll Forg instead of him devolved into "because he's trolling me." to because he's an evil atheist in his calling out videos. Chris gave pizza-faced atheist as Fork's defining characteristic, with a heretofore unseen vitriol. Chris's half-brother Cole Smithy, however, is also an atheist, although his opinion on him and his religion is, quite frankly, unclear. In the OkCupid answers, Chris stated that he would not date an atheist. On the other hand, the Wallflower told Chris in one of her emails that she had no religion. And as the rest of the correspondence shows, Chris was not bothered by her lack of faith and continued to pursue her. However, in his later revised OkCupid account, he states, to the surprise of nobody at all, that he would be willing to date an atheist if it meant he had the chance to obtain some hanky-panky. Finally, notes, for comparison, Christianity, the world's largest religion, made up by only 31% of the population at the time. Chris often suggests he is a goddess of everything, since he asks people who aren't even Sonichus or Rosechews in any of his provinces to pray for him, and Chris has even referred to what was most likely a synagogue as a Jewish church. Yeah, for all the difference that makes. And to be honest, the aspects of Chris's religion go a little further, and to be honest, they would make for a very interesting little sideline for now, but to be honest, we've been here for nearly an hour and a half, and I know there are some people out there who want to enjoy their Easter Sunday and enjoy the day of embracing the return of our Lord and Saviour Jesus Christ. And finally, to say Jesus has a somewhat doubting Thomas approach to all of this would be a bit of an understatement. Because not only does Chris doubt, but he also has no idea, or he does, but just chooses to practice nothing of it. In short, Chris's aspects of religion is very much in relation and correlation to Chris's attitudes towards the law, aka it is there for Chris to choose exactly what to make of it, whether it makes any sense or is inherently disingenuous or as anti-religion as possible. And that, as they say, is that. And with all that being said, I will see all of you guys again next time. Thank you.